Silence settles over the desert, long before history learns how to write itself. Long before borders, nations, or scriptures were compiled, a voice echoed through the wilderness between Egypt and Canaan, a voice that would shape the destiny of billions yet unborn. 4,000 years ago, under a merciless sun and endless sky, God spoke a promise so precise, so layered, that its consequences would ripple across centuries. It was spoken not to kings or armies, but to a desperate mother and her dying son, abandoned in the sand. That promise still breathes today. Hidden deep within the book of Genesis lies a story that does more than recount ancient family conflict. It unveils a destiny, a lineage, a people foretold before Islam had a name, before the Quran existed, before Muhammad was born. This is not speculation. It is a narrative etched into Scripture long before the world we know took shape. The story begins far from Canaan, in Ur of the Chaldeans, where God appeared to a man named Abram. With no map and no certainty, Abram was commanded to leave everything familiar behind. God promised him land, a great nation, a great name, and a blessing that would extend to all peoples of the earth. Abram obeyed, stepping into uncertainty, armed with nothing but faith. He journeyed into Canaan, where God reaffirmed the promise the land would belong to his offspring. But years passed, and the promise seemed to mock reality. Abram and his wife Sarai remained childless. Time pressed on, youth faded, and hope strained under the weight of biology. Abram spoke honestly to God, voicing the fear that his inheritance would pass to a servant instead of a son. God answered not with rebuke, but with wonder, leading Abram outside, pointing to the night sky, and declaring that his descendants would be as countless as the stars. And still, the waiting continued. Sarai, long past childbearing age, made a decision shaped by the customs of her time. She offered her Egyptian servant Hagar to Abram, believing she could build a family through her. Abram agreed. It was not God's plan, but it became part of God's story. Hagar conceived, and the household fractured. What began as a practical solution turned into bitterness, jealousy, and abuse. Hagar fled into the wilderness, pregnant and alone, carrying Abram's child with no destination and no protection. Death loomed close, yet it was there, beside a spring on the road to Shur, that heaven intervened. The angel of the Lord found her, an Egyptian slave woman, unseen by the world but seen by God. He spoke her name, he acknowledged her suffering, and then he delivered a command paired with a promise. She was to return and submit, not because her pain was insignificant, but because her future was immense. God promised that her descendants would be too numerous to count. Then came the prophecy that would echo through history. Her son would be named Ishmael, God hears. He would be fierce, independent, untamable, like a wild donkey of the desert. His hand would be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him. He would live in tension with his brothers. This was not an insult. It was a description of survival, freedom, and endurance in the harshest lands on earth. Overwhelmed, Hagar named God for the first time in Scripture. "You are the God who sees me." And she returned. Then Ishmael was born. Abram was 86 years old. For 13 years, Ishmael was his only son. Abram raised him, loved him, taught him the ways of the God who called him out of Ur. Ishmael grew strong, shaped by both his father's faith and his mother's desert wisdom. Abram believed the promise was fulfilled. Then, when Abram was 99, God appeared again. Names were changed. Abram became Abraham, Sarai became Sarah, and God declared that Sarah herself would bear a son. Abraham laughed, not in mockery, but in disbelief. Yet his heart spoke when he pleaded, "If only Ishmael might live under your blessing." God's answer was both firm and merciful. The covenant would pass through Isaac, the son yet to be born. But Ishmael would not be forgotten. He would be blessed. He would be fruitful. He would father 12 rulers. He would become a great nation. A year later, Isaac was born. 2 sons now lived under one roof. One the child of promise, the other the child of circumstance. Tension followed. At a feast celebrating Isaac's weaning, Sarah saw Ishmael mocking. Fear flared. She demanded that Hagar and Ishmael be sent away forever. Abraham's heart broke. Ishmael was his son. But God spoke again, assuring him that Ishmael's destiny was secure. The separation was necessary, but the promise remained. Demons at dawn, Abraham gave Hagar food and a skin of water and sent them into the wilderness of Beersheba. When the water ran out, death returned to the horizon. Hagar placed her son under a bush and walked away so she wouldn't have to watch him die. She wept. Ishmael cried, and God heard the boy. Once again, heaven opened. God reassured Hagar. He opened her eyes to a well that had been there all along. Life replaced despair. Ishmael lived. God was with him as he grew. He became an archer, a desert warrior, exactly as foretold. Ishmael settled in the wilderness. He married an Egyptian woman. His sons became tribal rulers. 12 princes rose from his line, spreading across Arabia from Havilah to Shur, controlling trade routes between civilizations, thriving where empires could not survive. They lived free, unconquered, fierce, fulfilling every word spoken over their ancestor in the desert. They appear again and again in Scripture. Traders of spices, warriors with bows, desert kings adorned in gold. They sold Joseph into slavery. They battled Israel. They prospered, endured, and remained distinct while empires rose and fell around them. Generations later, prophets spoke of them. Psalms described life among their tents. Isaiah warned of judgment and also foresaw a day when their settlements would rejoice and worship. Ezekiel listed them among the great trading powers of the world. They were never erased from God's story. And they never disappeared. Through centuries, through Assyria, Babylon, Greece, and Rome, the descendants of Ishmael endured. When the world shifted again in the 7th century, a new voice rose from the Arabian desert, a land shaped by prophecy, inhabited by a people promised long ago to become a great nation. Men the deserts that once echoed with the cries of a dying child now carried something else. Memory, lineage, an inherited fire patched from father to son, tribe to tribe. The people of the tents did not forget who they were, even when the world forgot them. They traced their bloodlines carefully, guarding ancestry like treasure, reciting names the way others recited prayers. And among those names, Ishmael always stood at the beginning. Arabia became more than sand and stone. It became a crossroads. Caravans moved through its valleys carrying frankincense, myrrh, spices, silk, and stories. The descendants of Ishmael mastered the routes between empires, untouched by thrones, yet essential to all of them. While kings ruled cities, Ishmael's children ruled distance itself. They lived between worlds, between Rome and Persia, between Africa and the Levant, free, proud, and unconquered. Yet, something else survived with them, the memory of one God. Abraham's faith did not vanish when Isaac inherited the covenant. It lingered in the desert, carried by Ishmael's line like an ember buried in ash. Over generations, that ember dimmed, covered by idols, tribal gods, and stone statues carved by human hands. But it never fully died. Stories of Abraham, of the one Creator, of the sacred house built in a barren valley. These stories endured, distorted but alive. On that valley had a name, Baca. Later, Makkah. Long before it became a city, it was only rock and silence. It was there that Abraham, guided by God, brought Hagar and Ishmael. It was there that Ishmael ran between two hills as his mother once had, searching for water. It was there that Zamzam burst forth, and it was there that Abraham and Ishmael, father and son reunited, raised the foundations of a house dedicated to the worship of the one God. "Please accept this from us," they prayed. "You are the all-hearing, the all-knowing." Plange in that house, the Kaaba, stood as a physical memory of a promise older than nations. Over time, it became surrounded by idols, claimed by tribes who forgot its origin, but its foundation never changed. It remained a symbol waiting to be restored. Centuries passed, empires collapsed, scriptures multiplied. Prophets rose among the children of Isaac: Moses, David, Solomon, Isaiah, Jesus. Peace be upon them all. Each called back to the same truth: worship God alone, live justly, remember the covenant. Yet the children of Ishmael watched from the margins of history, preserved for a moment, not yet revealed. Then, in the 6th century, in the very heart of that ancient valley, a child was born into the tribe of Quraysh, a tribe that traced its lineage carefully, directly back to Ishmael, son of Abraham. His name was Muhammad. He grew up an orphan, shaped by loss and reflection, known among his people not as a prophet, but as Al-Amin, the trustworthy one. He walked the same paths his ancestors had walked, traded on the same routes, slept under the same desert sky that once witnessed God's promises. And like Abraham before him, he retreated into solitude, searching for truth in a world drowning in idols. Then, in a cave on Mount Hira, the silence broke. The command was simple and overwhelming. Read, not to invent something new, but to remember, to restore, to reconnect humanity with the message that never changed. Muhammad did not bring a new God. He did not claim a new lineage. He called back to Abraham, to Ishmael, to Isaac, to Moses, to Jesus, one God, one message, one thread woven through history. The Quran spoke directly to what had been foretold thousands of years earlier. It confirmed Ishmael's story. It honored his mother Hagar. It restored Abraham's legacy in Arabia. It declared that this final message would rise from among a people once abandoned in the desert, just as promised in Genesis, a great nation too numerous to count. Banjist, those who once lived in tents, now carried revelation. Those who were once unseen now stood at the center of history. The descendants of Ishmael, long dismissed as outsiders, became the bearers of a message meant for all humanity. And suddenly, ancient words written in the Torah no longer felt distant. They felt alive. Lambda, a promise spoken to a slave woman in the wilderness, had reached its moment. The God who heard Ishmael had never stopped listening. The God who saw Hagar had never looked away. And the world did not welcome that message gently. Truth never arrives to applause when it threatens power, profit, and pride. In Makkah, the city that guarded the Kaaba yet had forgotten why it existed. The call to one God shook the foundations of tribal order. Idols were not just stone, they were economy, authority, and identity. To say they were false was to challenge everything. No, Muhammad stood alone at first, just as Abraham once had. He was mocked, accused of madness, poetry, sorcery, anything that would allow people to dismiss the message without confronting it. Yet the words continued to descend, clear and unyielding, reminding humanity of what it already knew but had buried beneath tradition. The Quran spoke in a language the desert understood, direct, rhythmic, piercing. It called people back to the covenant of Abraham, describing him not as Jew or Christian, but as one who submitted fully to God. It spoke of Ishmael without shame, restoring his place in sacred history. It reminded the Arabs that their ancestry was not accidental, it was preparation. Persecution intensified. Families were torn apart. Believers were tortured under the sun that once tested Hagar and her son. Some were killed for uttering a single sentence, "God is one." The descendants of Ishmael were now being refined by the same trial that had shaped their origin: patience in the desert, endurance in isolation, faith when no help seemed near. Then came migration. Just as Abraham left his homeland, Muhammad and his followers left Makkah for Medina. Not in defeat, but in obedience. And just as promises once unfolded slowly for Abraham, they began to unfold again. In Medina, the message took form, not as empire, but as community. Law was revealed, ethics were anchored, justice was demanded. The poor were elevated. Women were given rights unknown to the world. Slaves were called brothers, and lineage was stripped of superiority. The children of Ishmael were taught that nobility did not lie in blood, but in consciousness of God. Battle followed, not for conquest, but for survival. Small, ill-equipped groups stood against forces many times their size. And again, the pattern repeated. The weak were aided, the outnumbered prevailed. The promise moved forward. When Makkah was finally entered again, it was not with revenge, but with mercy. The city that once expelled the messenger watched him lower his head in humility. Idols were removed, not smashed in rage, but cleared to restore the house to what it was always meant to be. The Kaaba returned to the worship of the one God, just as Abraham and Ishmael had intended. The desert had come full circle. Brain from Adam to Noah, from Abraham to Moses, from Jesus to Muhammad. The message had never changed. Worship God alone. Live justly. Remember your purpose. The final revelation did not erase what came before it. It confirmed it, guarded it, and completed it. Then the promise to Ishmael was no longer hidden between lines of ancient scripture. It stood visible in history, in a nation that rose from sand, in a book memorized by millions, in a prayer echoed 5 times a day across the world. And yet the story was never meant to end with one people. The Quran spoke to humanity, not tribes. It called the children of Isaac and the children of Ishmael back to the same source. It reminded them that rivalry began not with God, but with fear. That separation was human, not divine. Man's the God who spoke to Hagar in the wilderness, who tested Abraham, who parted the sea for Moses, who strengthened Jesus, and who revealed the Quran to Muhammad, is one. The message is one. And so the journey returns to where it truly began, not in a land, not in a lineage, but in a question every human must face. Who do you worship? Banned from Adam, standing alone on earth, to Noah calling a drowning people, to Abraham breaking idols with his own hands, to Moses confronting a tyrant, to Jesus calling hearts back to mercy, to Muhammad restoring the final trust. The message remained untouched by time. Civilizations rose and fell around it. Languages changed. Empires claimed ownership over faith. Yet the core call never shifted. One God, one purpose, one path of responsibility. The story of Ishmael teaches us something deeper than ancestry. It teaches us that being pushed to the margins does not mean being forgotten. That abandonment in the eyes of the world can be placement in the plan of God. A child left in the desert became the root of a nation. A cry under a bush became a promise written into history. 2. And perhaps that is why this message still resonates, because humanity itself often feels lost in a wilderness of its own making, surrounded by noise, idols of power and desire, forgetting why the house was built in the first place. The message that never changed does not ask where you come from, It asks where you are going. It does not ask your name, your race, or your past. It asks your heart. History is not just something we study. It is something that calls us. And the same God who heard Ishmael still hears today. The same God who saw Hagar still sees you. The same message that echoed from the desert still waits, unchanged, uncompromised, and alive, for anyone willing to listen.